Today, I'm going to be giving you an introduction to leopard gecko care. The idea with this is to get you started with your animals, not to go into full detail, so I highly recommend that you do further research after watching this video. To aid with this, I've put some links to additional information down in the description. For someone looking to keep a leopard gecko as a pet, the most popular enclosures are made of glass, wood or PVC, with each of these materials having its pros and cons. Glass vivaria usually have mesh tops and are therefore very well ventilated, but unlike wooden and PVC enclosures, they cannot be screwed into, so are more difficult to adapt with furnishings. There are also different heating considerations for the different enclosure styles, but these will be discussed slightly later in the video. Whatever type of enclosure you select, it should have doors on the front to allow proper access, and it should be at least 90 by 45 by 45 centimeters for a single leopard gecko. The tank I'm setting up today is smaller than this, but it's only going to be used as temporary housing for hatchling leopard geckos that have bred and I'm waiting to sell. As it happens, at 60 by 45 by 30 centimeters, this enclosure is about the size most other care guides would recommend for long-term housing, but having now kept leopard geckos myself for 8 years, I wouldn't recommend keeping them in something this small. As you can see, my 3 adult leopard geckos have a 90 by 60 by 70 centimeter enclosure split into 2 levels, and when they're active during the night, they make ready use of all of it. On that note, you may be wondering about whether you could, or indeed whether you should, keep multiple leopard geckos in one enclosure, this practice being called cohabitation. The short answer is that if you haven't got a couple of years of experience keeping leopard geckos, and especially if you don't have a full spare enclosure to separate your animals if necessary, then I would not cohabitate them. However, if you do have some experience and do have a spare enclosure, then I actually would recommend cohabitation. Leopard geckos are naturally communal animals, so if you can safely keep them together, then this is going to be a great form of enrichment. I must say though that this is an extremely contentious point, and if you would like to know more about it, then check out the referenced link in the description. The first thing you're going to lay down in your enclosure is what goes on the bottom, called the substrate. There are many different options for this, but personally I would opt for some combination of the sand or soil that you can get at a supermarket or garden centre, as these are going to allow your gecko to dig. In this setup I'm using plain builder's sand, largely to prove the point that sand does not kill healthy leopard geckos. If you haven't heard of this myth before, it might sound ludicrous, but it actually does stem from a pocket of truth. If leopard geckos are kept in properly, that is, without proper lighting, a good diet, adequate hydration or the ability to raise the body temperature sufficiently, they might become unable to excrete the small quantities of substrate that they accidentally ingest, and they might even be driven to consume the substrate actively in search of minerals. This can result in a potentially fatal condition called impaction, where the gut becomes blocked with the substrate. Leopard geckos are shy by nature, so their enclosures should be well decorated with rocks and wood to allow them to hide wherever they want to. You can buy ready-made hides from reptile shops, but honestly I think there's nothing better than cork bark, which can also be bought from reptile shops, and also real rocks, which you can just pick up at the beach or buy from a garden centre. Note that any heavy objects should be supported by the very base of the enclosure, so that if your gecko tries to dig under them, it won't get crushed. Now, unlike many other gecko species, leopard geckos lack adhesive toe pads and so can't climb smooth surfaces, but they're still quite good at going up branches, so it's worth adding a couple to the enclosure. Although leopard geckos are mostly active at night, they will still bask under gentle dawn or dusk sunlight, and this is known to have considerable benefits for them. To replicate dawn or dusk sunlight, we'll start by breaking up sunlight into components, the most important ones being ultraviolet B, visible light and near infrared. A fourth component to consider will be ultraviolet A, but as nobody really knows much about offering it, I won't discuss it further here. Ultraviolet B, or UVB, is most famous for inducing the synthesis of vitamin D3 in the skin, and this applies to leopard geckos as much as it does to humans. We quantify the intensity of UVB in units of the UV index, or UVI. For a leopard gecko, a UVI of 1 to 2 in the basking zone, grading down to 0 in the shade, is appropriate, and this can be provided with a UVB emitting fluorescent lamp. Where the basking zone is about 25 cm from this lamp, which is going to be the case in most typically dimensioned vivaria, an Arcadia's Shade Dweller Pro T5 fixture would offer the appropriate UVI, as would a 10.0 compact fluorescent in a standard vivarium canopy. Usually, 10.0 bulbs are marketed for diurnal, sun-worshipping reptiles like bearded dragons, but when it comes to compact fluorescent lamps, this is erroneous, so don't fret that there's not going to be a picture of a leopard gecko on the front of the box. Note that if you do choose to use a compact fluorescent, a canopy should be chosen which holds the lamp horizontally, not vertically, so that it illuminates a wider area that the gecko can choose to access. Whichever UV lamp you choose, a mesh will partially stop the UVB from getting through, so where a mesh will be present, the basking area will need to be brought closer to the light for the gecko to receive adequate UVB exposure. Using one of the aforementioned lamps, a distance of about 15 cm between the basking zone and the mesh will yield the required UVI. Also know that the output of fluorescent lamps decreases over time, so they're going to need to be replaced as per manufacturer's guidelines, usually once every 9 to 12 months. As for near-infrared, we quantify the most biologically significant component of this, called infrared A, in units of watts per metre squared. An intensity of 150 to 200 watts per metre squared is about what we're aiming for, and far and away the best thing for offering this is a traditional light bulb, either a halogen lamp or, if unavailable, an incandescent lamp. There are other units known as heat projectors which are sold by a number of brands as being dedicated towards the provision of near-infrared, but the near-infrared composition is actually much less similar to sunlight than that offered by good old-fashioned light bulbs. Now as for the specific model of light bulb you should use, a 50 watt flood lamp with a reflective sleeve, such as the Exoterra Daylight Basking Spot, will work well for near-infrared provision in most enclosures. Note that these lamps are only gently reflected. Other lamps, such as, for example, a 50 watt par 20 halogen, are much more strongly reflected and will be far too intense when installed at typical distances from the basking zone. You can see here that the recommended bulbs offer the desired intensity of 150 to 200 watts per metre squared at standard distances, whereas the more strongly reflected lamp is much too intense, only being suitable for use with the leopard gecko when in considerable excess of 30 cm away from the basking zone. A simple way to check that your lamp is offering approximately the right intensity of near-infrared is simply to put your hand underneath it where the gecko would bask. You should only just be able to perceive your hand getting warmer, and by this I really mean only just. The last chunk of sunlight for us to consider is visible light. Actually, the two lamps already discussed will offer low intensity visible light, and for a leopard gecko you needn't offer anything in addition to this. If, however, you would like to grow plants in your enclosure or you feel that it looks dark, an LED can be added to no detriment. All lamps should be plugged into a timer so that they come on for 12 hours each day and go off for 12 hours at night. Also notice that your fluorescent UV lamp, your incandescent lamp or halogen, and any other lamps you may have chosen to install should be placed as close together as possible so that they illuminate the same area. You should control the temperature of your gecko's enclosure without making alterations to the lighting, because although the lamps will all cause the enclosure to get warmer, dimming them will throw off the sunlight conditions you've worked hard to replicate. Therefore, your lighting should not be controlled by a thermostat. Now when your gecko basks, it'll get warmer through absorbing the radiation offered by the lamps. Provided that the enclosure is not so cold that the gecko's got to bask for unfeasibly long to reach its working body temperature, and so long as the enclosure is not that warm that the gecko is forced above its working body temperature, then it'll be able to regulate its own temperature simply by choosing whether or not to bask, and for how long. Therefore, the only temperature that really matters in the vivarium is the ambient temperature, and this can be measured with a thermometer positioned away from any lighting on the floor of the enclosure. If the reading on this thermometer regularly exceeds 30 degrees C, you will need to cool the enclosure down. This is a common occurrence during the summer in wooden and PVC enclosures, which are, by nature, well insulated. To cool these sorts of enclosures down, ventilation should be increased. Your first protocol will be to cut a hole in the side or, preferably, the top of the enclosure and cover this hole with a mesh to prevent the gecko's escape. Monitor the temperature in the enclosure, and if it's still uncomfortably high, the next step will be to power ventilation using computer fans. The aim is to have enough ventilation that if, for some reason, your lights were to be locked on 24/7 at the hottest time of year, the enclosure still would not overheat, and I should add that this isn't difficult to achieve. If you set up your enclosure like this, you'll see why it's perfectly safe not to have a thermostat present. Now, whether you have a glass enclosure or a properly ventilated wooden one, you might find that during the cooler parts of the year, your gecko rarely moves away from the basking zone, suggesting that it's too cold. If this is the case, you can trap heat inside the enclosure simply by switching off fans, wrapping the enclosure with wood or insulation foam and covering vents or mesh, although be careful to keep some ventilation to allow the gecko to breathe. Because a glass enclosure is so poorly insulated, these changes might still not be enough to keep it sufficiently warm. If you find this is the case, tape a small heat mat under 10 watts onto the side of the enclosure adjacent to the basking spot. Doing this will increase the input of heat to the enclosure without changing the lighting. Make sure that the mat is not obstructed by any objects either inside or outside the enclosure, because this could impede heat loss from the glass, causing it to overheat and crack. So long as you set up the heat mat properly as described, there is no reason to run it on a thermostat. What I'm trying to get at here is that managing the temperature is really just about altering how fast heat can escape the enclosure, which for the most part you can do just by altering ventilation and insulation. You don't need to make it any more complicated than this. Now, whilst it is true that the lighting in the enclosure will be the primary source of heat, the role of the lighting is to recreate sunlight. So if the enclosure gets too hot or too cold, you shouldn't start dimming lamps or changing wattages, which is what most other care guides will recommend, because whilst this might get the temperature to where you want it to be, it's also going to alter the sunlight conditions. Now, on the topic of things getting cold, you might be surprised to learn that leopard geckos will actually hibernate if you allow them to get cold enough during the winter. If you keep them warm still, they will remain active, although you might notice that they reduce their activity and demand less food. Whether or not you should allow your leopard gecko to hibernate is up for debate, because whilst it's certainly not essential, hibernation is reported to extend the lifespans and increase the breeding vigour of leopard geckos, so it probably is beneficial. Until they've gained some experience, beginner keepers may opt not to let their animals hibernate, which makes sense. And geckos which are very young, i.e. under 6 months of age, might have insufficient fat reserves to do well in hibernation, so these should be kept awake. A very broad outline of how to facilitate hibernation in a leopard gecko would be the following. When the weather outside starts to turn in late autumn or early winter, stop feeding the gecko, switch off any heat mats, and on a daily basis, reduce the length of time that the lights are switched on for by a small increment. This should be done so that after a month, the lighting will be off permanently, at which stage the gecko can be moved somewhere that remains between 0 and 10 degrees C. A fridge or garage may be ideal for this. At this temperature, the gecko will go dormant. Personally, I then allow my leopard geckos a full 3 months in this condition, but you may choose only to hibernate your leopard gecko for a month or 2. However long it is, once this period is up, the gecko should be returned to its enclosure. Initially, all the electrical equipment in the enclosure should be switched off. In a reverse of the process described earlier, the length of time that the lights are switched on for should be increased incrementally each day so that after a month, the 12-hour day length is resumed. At this point, supplemental heating can be turned back on. Now when it begins to stir, the leopard gecko can be offered its first feed of the year. This does mean that the gecko might not have eaten in up to 5 months, but a healthy leopard gecko is actually going to have lost no more than a couple of grams through this entire period, so it's nothing to worry about. During the warmer months, an adult leopard gecko should be fed 1 to 5 insects each week, depending on the size of the insects, whereas a juvenile under 6 months of age will need to eat several times this amount to fuel its growth. Obesity is an extremely common issue in leopard geckos, so don't be tempted to feed adults any more than the recommended amount. Live insects, which may be bought at reptile shops, are all that leopard geckos need to eat, although they will readily consume any animal that they're large enough to overpower and swallow. Now 3 quick notes on the insects are that, firstly, worms should be considered as treat items because of the relatively high fat content. Secondly, crickets, locusts and dubia roaches will do best when kept in a well-ventilated enclosure and will only thrive when kept warm, for example with a heat mat. Thirdly, all prey items, except some worms like waxworms which have very particular diets, should be fed with plain breakfast cereal and vegetables to ensure that they're in the best condition when offered to your gecko. Now just before you feed some insects to your gecko, put them in a cup and coat them lightly with a vitamin and mineral supplement. Truth be told, nobody, not even the companies that say they do, actually knows the doses of different vitamins and minerals that leopard geckos require, so there is not a best reptile supplement on the market for me to recommend. All I do is adopt the approach of little and often by using a variety of off-the-shelf reptile supplements in rotation. Leopard geckos should be offered with clean tap water in a bowl which they will readily drink from when they're thirsty. They are known, both in captivity and in the wild, to appreciate times of higher humidity, so their enclosure should be given a heavy spray down with lukewarm water once or twice a week, although do note that this isn't actually essential for them to survive if you intend on going on holiday. Additionally, maintain at least one hiding area in the enclosure as a humid hide by spraying the substrate underneath it with water. The gecko will then be able to access higher humidity whenever it so chooses. And that concludes this video on how to look after a leopard gecko. If you did enjoy it, then feel free to say so in the comments, and do subscribe to my channel because for today, I've been JTB Reptiles teaching you how to follow nature's example, and I'll see all of you in the next video.